They called it a pilgrimage. But what kind of holy road begins with fire and ends with starvation? In the chronicles of medieval shrines, there is one ritual so brutal it borders on madness. Pilgrims, ordinary men and women, desperate for salvation, were told to abandon food, abandon bread, abandon life itself. For 40 days their mouths touched nothing but melted candle wax, not blessed wine, not sacred bread, only thick burning wax poured down their throats in place of nourishment. Each swallow burned the lips, coated the tongue, sealed the stomach like stone. They said pain was the true offering, that suffering itself was prayer. And so hundreds marched, choking back the wax, believing that agony purified the soul. But the body does not bend forever to faith. Some collapsed on the roadside, wax still clinging to their teeth. Others coughed blood, their insides shredded by what they swallowed. Still, the rest pressed forward, eyes hollow, steps breaking. And here is the darkest part. Records whisper that some actually made it, that they reached the shrine alive, little more than walking corpses. But tell me, what was holier, the shrine they reached or the suffering that carried them there? The pilgrims called it devotion. Their priests called it purification. But to watch it unfold was to witness a slow execution carried out in the name of faith. The journey began at the lighting of a candle, a single flame flickering in the dark chapel. Wax melted into a cup. The cup was raised to trembling lips. The swallow was not of wine, not of blessed water, but of the molten liquid that moments before burned with fire. That was the first step, taking in the flame itself, as if swallowing light would bring them closer to God. From that moment, bread was forbidden. Water was discouraged. Only wax could pass their lips. They would march with candles in their hands, their tongues raw and their throats scarred, each step a reminder that pain was their offering. Chroniclers tell of wax hardening inside the body, forming clumps that tore through intestines. Some pilgrims died within days, their bodies bent double in agony, their devotion marked by wax leaking from their mouths in their final spasms. But their deaths were not considered failure, only proof of how much the body could endure before the soul was released. The ones who endured longer became strange to behold, thin as skeletons, yet their eyes glowed with a fanatic's fire. Their voices cracked when they tried to pray, their throats lined with layers of hardened residue. They smelled of smoke and wax, their skin pale, their lips permanently blistered. Yet they clung to the belief that suffering was the key, that if they could walk 40 days in hunger and pain, they would step into holiness itself. Villages along the route feared them. Mothers pulled their children indoors when the wax pilgrims approached. They looked less like worshippers and more like revenants, staggering forward with cracked candles and blackened mouths. Some accounts describe the sound they made when they walked together, a low chorus of wheezing, coughing, choking. To hear them coming down the road was to hear the sound of death marching in pilgrimage. But why? Why wax? The answer lies in the symbolism preached by those who led them. Wax was born of flame. It melted to light the world. To consume it, they believed, was to consume the fire of God itself. It was not nourishment of the body, but nourishment of the soul. The agony was intentional. To eat bread was comfort. To drink water was survival. To swallow wax was death creeping into the body with every gulp. And that, they said, was the truest sacrifice. Still, records show that even among believers, doubts crept in. Not all who began the path finished it. Some broke under the pain, slipping away at night to steal food, ashamed but unable to continue. Those who faltered were branded cowards, accused of clinging to the flesh instead of the spirit. Their names were struck from the rolls of the faithful. Better to die choking on wax than live another day with bread, the priest told them. Better to collapse in agony at the roadside than eat in comfort and abandon the soul. The path of wax was not just ritual, it was spectacle. Shrines recorded the numbers of those who began and those who perished, as though keeping score of faith's victories over flesh. And for the survivors, those gaunt shadows who made it 40 days, the shrines claimed miracles. Candles lit on their arrival were said never to burn out until the last pilgrim collapsed. The wax inside them, hardened and unyielding, was praised as proof that their bodies had been reshaped by devotion. Some medieval manuscripts even hint that relics were taken from these pilgrims. Not bones, not blood, but the lumps of hardened wax found in their bodies after death. They were preserved in reliquaries displayed as sacred evidence of devotion, tokens said to carry the heat of the divine flame. To the faithful, these grotesque remains were not signs of madness, but proof of contact with the holy. What is most disturbing, however, is how the ritual spread. Other shrines, eager to match the spectacle, adopted similar practices. In some regions, pilgrims were forced to chew unlit chunks of wax, their jaws aching as they swallowed lump after lump. Elsewhere, melted wax was mixed with ashes, forming a black sludge that was swallowed in place of meals. The core idea remained the same. Suffering was holiness, pain was purification. And as long as people believed it, the path of wax endured. But devotion can mask madness. And when belief demands blood and suffering, when it tells men and women to swallow fire until their insides collapse, one must ask, was this holiness? Or was it cruelty wearing the mask of God? The Pilgrims believed they were consuming light, but in truth they were consuming death. Slowly, deliberately, one swallow at a time. To watch a wax pilgrim in the later days of their journey was to see the body transformed into something neither fully alive nor yet a corpse. Chroniclers wrote of their eyes sunken deep into skulls, lips cracked and bleeding, and voices rasping like broken reeds. Yet in their misery, they did not turn back. They pressed onward as if bound by invisible chains, convinced their agony was proof of holiness. Each gulp of wax became a contest between body and will. The body screamed in protest, vomiting, choking, twisting in convulsions. The will answered by forcing another swallow, another step. For some, madness set in early. The wax clogged their stomachs, creating an unbearable pressure that no prayer could soothe. They staggered through villages with swollen bellies and hollow cheeks, looking like pregnant skeletons. Some tore at their own throats, trying to claw the wax back out, their nails bloodied and broken. But not all madness was born of pain. Some claimed visions, bright lights behind closed eyes, voices whispering in the silence of night. They said angels spoke to them, promising salvation if they endured. Priests, eager to fan the flames of devotion, declared these hallucinations divine signs. In reality, starvation and poisoned guts were playing cruel tricks on the mind. Yet the visions spread hope, and hope bound them to the path more tightly than chains ever could. Families followed too. Entire households sometimes joined the march, fathers leading wives and children into the fire. The young suffered worst of all. Their smaller bodies collapsed quickly under the ritual. Records speak of children no older than 10 coughing blood, their cries muffled by clumps of hardened wax. Parents wept but kept walking, lifting their children's bodies onto carts, convinced that even in death the child had been blessed by the trial. To abandon the ritual would mean damning the whole family. And so the fire spread not just within the body, but within entire communities. Villages were split between those who joined the pilgrimage and those who recoiled in horror. Arguments erupted. Brothers turned against brothers, one proclaiming the sanctity of suffering, the other denouncing it as madness. But in an age where faith was survival, to speak against the ritual was dangerous. Some who resisted were dragged along, forced to swallow wax under threat of being branded heretics. Thus, the ritual thrived not only by choice but by fear. The priests knew the power of suffering. They stood at the shrines, welcoming the broken figures who arrived half dead. They declared them miracles, living martyrs, proof that God favored those who endured. They held up survivors as proof of divine will, while the corpses were buried in shallow graves along the road, forgotten but for their tally in the chronicles. The message was clear. Survival meant sainthood. Death meant sacrifice. There was no failure, only proof that faith had been tested. But beneath the sermons and prayers, there was also control. By demanding pain, the leaders bound the faithful to them. To suffer was to obey. To disobey was to betray God himself. Fear and devotion became indistinguishable. And when faith is welded to fear, when obedience is measured in agony, there is no limit to what can be demanded. Some say the shrines grew rich from the spectacle. Pilgrims who survived left offerings, convinced they had touched holiness. Families of the dead donated wealth to secure prayers for their loved ones' souls. The shrines gleamed with gold, even as the roads to them were lined with corpses. Faith had become currency, and wax was the coin it demanded. And yet, the strangest truth of all is that some pilgrims did change. Survivors often spoke of a terrible clarity, of feeling reborn, their bodies hollowed of fleshly weakness. They described walking as if weightless, as if pain had burned away all earthly desire. Whether this was faith, madness, or merely the numbness of a starved brain, no one can say. But their testimonies became powerful weapons. For every soul horrified by the ritual, another was inspired by tales of those who claimed to have seen God. Others swore they saw fire within the survivor's eyes, a literal glow, a reflection of candles carried for weeks, or perhaps only the fever burning through their weakened bodies. Priests used these tales as living proof. These were not broken husks, but chosen vessels, touched by the divine. Doubters were silenced by spectacle, by stories, by the sheer terror of questioning what everyone else called holy. The fire within was more than ritual, it was infection. An idea passed from pilgrim to pilgrim, from survivor to witness, spreading further than any road could carry them. And once lit, such fire does not simply fade. It lingers in the mind, in the whispers of history, reminding us how far belief can drive flesh toward the grave and how easily agony can be mistaken for holiness. By the time the wax pilgrims reached the shrines, they were no longer simply travelers. They were shadows of themselves, stripped of flesh, of dignity, of everything except belief. And belief was the only thing demanded. The shrines did not offer rest or relief. They offered spectacle. Witnesses described the arrival of the pilgrims as if watching the dead walk into holy ground. Some crawled on all fours, unable to stand. Others leaned on staffs, their bones visible beneath skin stretched paper thin. When they collapsed at the gates, attendants dragged them forward so that their bodies touched the sacred stones. At the shrines, priests stood waiting, clothed in robes heavy with gold embroidery. They proclaimed the pilgrims' miracles, praising their endurance as proof that God's fire had not consumed but transformed them. Survivors were paraded before the faithful. They were made to hold candles, the same candles whose wax had nearly killed them, as though now their suffering had been sanctified. The crowd cheered, not in pity, but in awe. Pain, it seemed, had been converted into proof of divine presence. But the shrines were more than spiritual theaters. They were machines of control. Each arrival brought offerings, wealth from families who believed their loved one had ascended into sainthood, coins dropped into boxes, livestock donated, land deeds signed over. The shrines grew rich, while pilgrims collapsed in heaps outside their gates. The more grotesque the suffering, the greater the offering. Pain itself became currency, and the shrines thrived as banks of human misery. Eyewitness accounts linger on the details. A pilgrim whose lips had sealed shut from burns, forced open with a knife so he could swallow one final lump of wax before collapsing. A mother dragging the corpse of her child into the shrine, convinced that the mere presence of the body on holy ground meant salvation. Old men whose bellies swelled grotesquely with hardened wax, their bodies cracking under the strain. Each was exalted, each turned into sermon material. The priest pointed and declared, "See how faith triumphs." But in truth, it was the triumph of endurance over flesh and death over life. In some cases, relics were harvested. The hardened wax removed from bodies was collected, displayed in reliquaries, kissed by the faithful as though fragments of holiness itself. These lumps, formed from agony, were treated like jewels. It was as if the shrines declared that suffering could be preserved, crystallized, and sold as proof of contact with the divine. And people believed it. For centuries, records show pilgrims traveling great distances to glimpse the wax relics, to press lips to glass and pray to what was once poison. But not all accounts are filled with reverence. Some travelers wrote of horror. A chronicler from the north describes the stench of vomit and death clinging to the shrine roads, the moans of the dying echoing through the valleys. He called it not a pilgrimage, but a procession of corpses. Others condemned the priests, accusing them of orchestrating a ritual that destroyed more lives than it saved. Yet these voices were few, and most were silenced. To question the ritual was to question God, and in the medieval world, such questions rarely ended in mercy. The shrines themselves became fortresses of authority. Entire towns grew around them, feeding off the endless stream of pilgrims. Merchants sold candles by the thousands, fueling the ritual with commerce. Inns profited from grieving families who followed in mourning. Even gravediggers found steady work. A whole economy built itself upon wax and pain, and so long as it thrived, there was little reason for the practice to end. Ceremonies became elaborate. Survivors were made to stand before the altar, trembling and broken, while choirs sang praises. The smell of incense covered the odor of sickness. Priests dipped fingers into wax relics and smeared the substance across the foreheads of new initiates, binding them to the same path. The crowd, swayed by spectacle, shouted blessings. Children lifted on shoulders were told to look, to remember, to follow when their time came. It was not only faith being forged, it was indoctrination in plain sight. Foreign travelers who witnessed the rituals carried tales back to their lands. Some denounced the shrines as places of madness, warning that they turned faith into a carnival of suffering. Others marveled at the strength of devotion, seeing in it proof of a people so loyal to God, they would gladly kill themselves to be nearer to Him. The story spread, twisted, reshaped with each telling, until the shrines became infamous across regions as both holy sanctuaries and houses of horror. There are even whispers of markets forming around the relics. Merchants carried tiny fragments of wax across kingdoms, claiming they came from the stomachs of the pilgrims. Some were fakes, but it hardly mattered. Buyers kissed them, prayed over them, and paid fortunes to hold a piece of suffering in their hands. Suffering had become a product, packaged and sold, as if the agony of thousands could be bottled and traded like spice or silk. Families were torn apart. Some rejoiced when a loved one returned alive, gaunt and broken, but alive, and declared a living saint. Others received only bodies, buried in silence outside the shrines. There are accounts of mothers kneeling at the gates, demanding the return of their children's remains, only to be told that the wax inside them was too holy to surrender. Faith had stolen not only their lives, but their bodies. The bereaved were left with nothing but empty hands and shattered prayers. In some chronicles, priests are said to have staged miracles at the shrines. Survivors were paraded not only as saints, but as healers. Their wax-hardened stomachs were said to radiate divine warmth. Some were made to touch the sick, the blind, the crippled. And when the sick sometimes improved, as illness often rises and falls on its own, the crowds shouted that proof had been given. Faith turned coincidence into wonder, and wonder drew more pilgrims to the path of wax. And here lies the darkest truth. The shrines knew. They knew the ritual destroyed bodies. They knew it claimed children and the old, the weak and the strong alike. But they also knew that the greater the suffering, the greater the devotion. And so they encouraged it, fanned the flames of faith, demanded more. In the language of sanctity, they disguised hunger. In the name of holiness, they baptized people with fire. Every broken pilgrim was fuel for their altar. Consider what it means when faith requires death to prove its worth, when agony is paraded as miracle, when corpses become relics, when starvation is wrapped in prayer. The shrines did not simply guide the faithful, they consumed them. They turned living bodies into offerings, not of bread or coin, but of flesh. The ritual of wax was not only a test of faith, it was a machine of power, grinding lives into devotion and gold. And yet the most haunting question lingers. How many believed to the end? How many swallowed the wax not out of fear, not out of coercion, but with trembling joy, convinced they were consuming the fire of God? How many went willingly into agony, believing that death itself would open heaven's gates? That question has no answer, but the chronicles leave us fragments, whispers, broken testimonies of those who endured. Together they form a picture of a world where pain was proof and suffering was sanctified. What remained after the shrines had taken their toll? For many it was only silence, broken families, and graves dug in haste. The path of wax was not a fleeting ritual. It left marks that lingered long after the candles were extinguished. Survivors carried bodies home on carts or in sacks, burying them in fields far from the shrines. Some could not even claim their dead, for the priests had already stripped the corpses for relics. Families wept not only for lives lost, but for bodies stolen, parceled out as if pieces of flesh could be turned into prayer. For those who survived, survival was not salvation. Their bodies bore scars, invisible and visible. Wax hardened in their stomachs sometimes remained for years, forming stones that slowly poisoned them from within. Chroniclers describe survivors collapsing months after returning home, their insides still clogged, their breath still carrying the faint smell of smoke. Many could no longer eat without pain, their throats seared raw, their stomachs unable to process bread or water. They lived half lives, neither alive nor dead, walking testaments to the cruelty of the ritual. And yet some were exalted. These survivors were paraded as saints in their villages. Their broken voices were said to echo with divine resonance. Their skeletal frames became living icons of endurance. People sought their blessing, kissed their blistered hands, and pressed sick children against their wax-scarred skin, hoping holiness might rub off. But for every blessing given, another survivor collapsed alone, forgotten, their supposed sainthood dissolving in agony. The scars were not only physical. Families were divided, trust shattered. Some cursed the shrines, whispering that they had been deceived, that God could not demand such torment. Others clung more tightly to belief, insisting their loved ones' deaths were not in vain. Entire villages fractured. Faith turned into a wedge that split homes apart. Brothers argued over whether to join the next pilgrimage. Mothers forbade it, while fathers insisted it was the only path to salvation. The path of wax did not end at the shrine. It echoed through every home. There are accounts of children raised in fear of candles. A single flame would send them trembling, remembering the day their parents swallowed molten light in front of them. Some refused to step inside churches again, believing every flicker of fire carried the threat of death. Yet others embraced the ritual more fiercely, raised on stories of ancestors who became saints through wax. Faith and trauma became tangled until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. The wider world, too, felt the echoes. Regions that opposed the ritual were branded faithless. Wars of words broke out between clerics, some praising the wax as holy trial, others condemning it as idolatry. But even condemnation could not erase its grip. The spectacle was too powerful, too deeply rooted. It had become more than ritual, it had become identity. To walk away from it was to walk away from God, or so the priests warned. Some chronicles tell of families who tried to erase the ritual from memory, burning candles only for light, never for prayer. Yet whispers endured. Around fires, elders retold the stories of those who endured 40 days of wax. In hushed tones, parents warned children never to speak against the shrines, even as they quietly feared them. Generations later, the memory lingered like a scar that could not heal. For some, it became a tale of courage. For others, a nightmare passed down like inheritance. In the end, the ashes of devotion spread far. They lay not only in the charred remains of candles, not only in the graves outside shrines, but in the hearts of those who lived after. The wax was gone, but its shadow remained, a memory that stained generations. And though time dulled its flame, the question it left behind never faded. What is the price of faith, and who decides how much blood or wax it must cost? The ritual of wax did not vanish cleanly. Like the smoke of a snuffed candle, it lingered, curling through memory, history, and whispered rumor. Even as the practice faded, its echoes remained, shaping the way people viewed suffering and sanctity for centuries. It became both legend and warning, a tale retold in hushed voices around hearths, in sermons disguised as history, in the fears of children who trembled at candlelight. Some said the wax pilgrims had left a curse. Villagers reported hearing coughs and gasps on the roads where pilgrims once walked, as if their ghosts still staggered along, choking on hardened lumps of devotion. Travelers swore that melted wax sometimes dripped from stones near old shrines, though no candle burned there. Priests, when pressed, claimed these were miracles, signs that the holy fire still lived. But to the people who saw them, it felt more like a haunting, the dead refusing to stay buried. The wax ritual also lived on in other forms. Later sects twisted its memory into fasting rites, encouraging followers to endure pain as proof of faith. While they did not drink wax, they recalled it as the highest example of devotion and measured their own suffering against it. Some wore bands of hardened wax around their arms or necks until their skin blistered, imitating the agony of their ancestors. Even when the ritual itself was banned, its logic remained. Suffering meant purity, and the closer one came to death, the nearer one came to God. The shrines, stripped of their most grotesque practices, still wielded power. Candles remained at the heart of their rituals, each flame a silent reminder of what had once been demanded. Pilgrims continued to walk, though no longer required to swallow fire. Yet the air of those places remained thick with memory. Chroniclers centuries later noted the unease of travelers who described feeling watched, judged, as if the stones themselves carried the cries of those who had died. History had been buried, but the earth still whispered, and still the stories spread. Parents told children of the wax martyrs, sometimes to inspire, sometimes to terrify. Plays were staged in marketplaces, actors staggering across wooden boards with fake candles and painted lips. Audiences wept or cheered or shuddered. What had once been ritual became entertainment, and in turning agony into spectacle, its memory refused to fade. The suffering had become myth, but myth has a way of holding onto truth like bone clinging to flesh. Even skeptics could not fully erase it. Scholars argued whether the ritual had been exaggeration, whether accounts had grown monstrous over centuries of retelling. But bones with traces of hardened wax were found near old shrines, lending terrible weight to the stories. The debate became not whether it happened, but how many had been consumed, and every discovery reignited fear. If faith could once demand such horrors, could it not do so again? The echoes lived not just in ritual, but in the human heart. In every prayer that called pain holy, in every sacrifice demanded for purity, the shadow of wax still flickered. Though centuries passed, the lesson was never fully learned, because the wax had never truly been about candles or shrines or relics. It had been about control, about how far belief could bend flesh, about how leaders could turn agony into obedience. That truth, once revealed, could not be hidden. And so the flame still burns, not in the shrines, not in the candles, but in the warnings etched into memory. Every time we tell the story, every time a candle flickers in silence, the echoes return. Not as devotion, not as miracle, but as reminder of how easily light can become fire, and fire can consume the soul. They called it pilgrimage. But what kind of road asks the faithful to drink fire? We began with men and women swallowing wax, believing each burn carried them closer to heaven. Now we end with their shadows, their whispers still curling through history. What began as ritual became memory. What became memory turned into legend. And yet even legends have a way of reaching through the centuries to grip us by the throat. Think of what they endured. 40 days of choking, starving, coughing blood, wax clogging throats, sealing stomachs, tearing lives apart. Think of the shrines that called their suffering holy, that fed on agony and turned death into spectacle. Priests paraded the survivors like trophies, buried the dead in silence, and called it proof of God's favor. Families were split, children were scarred, and all of it in the name of devotion. It would be comforting to believe such madness belongs only to the past, that humanity has grown wiser, more merciful, less willing to trade flesh for faith. But history does not vanish so easily. Every age has its candles, its shrines, its rituals that demand too much. They may not burn wax in chalices anymore, but they burn something. Sometimes it is food withheld in hunger strikes. Sometimes it is blood spilled in cults. Sometimes it is lives consumed by ideology so powerful it convinces people to walk willingly into fire. The path of wax reminds us of a truth too dark to dismiss. People will endure anything if they believe it sanctifies their pain. They will starve, bleed, burn, and call it holy. And leaders, cloaked in robes or flags or symbols of authority, will always be ready to demand more. The faces may change, the rituals may shift, but the logic remains the same. Suffering can be sold as salvation, and when people believe it, the fire always returns. The pilgrims of wax are long dead, their bones scattered, their names forgotten, yet their steps echo still. They remind us how fragile the line is between devotion and destruction. For them, the flame was God's test. For us, it may take another form, a voice, an image, an ideology demanding sacrifice. And when it comes, the choice will be the same: obey, suffer, and call it holy, or turn away and be branded faithless. So the question is not whether the wax ritual ended. It did. The question is whether it truly died, or whether it only waits, hidden, to take another form. Somewhere, even now, there are those who preach that agony purifies, that pain is proof, that to break the body is to cleanse the soul. They may not hand pilgrims cups of molten wax, but they hand them other fires, just as deadly. And that is the true horror, that the shrines are not only in the past, that they may rise again, whenever faith forgets compassion and remembers only power. And when they do, the footsteps of the wax pilgrims will echo once more, a procession of ghosts walking beside the living. You will not see them, but you may hear them. Rasping breaths, choking coughs, the faint crackle of wax sealing shut a throat. So next time you light a candle, ask yourself, does its flame comfort you, or does it demand something more? When the wax begins to melt, will you see light, or hear the whispers of those who swallowed fire, believing it would save them? Because their story has not gone out. It still burns, flickering in silence, waiting for someone to mistake the fire for God. And when that moment comes, when belief once again demands the body as proof, perhaps the world will find itself walking the path of wax all over again.